Before we will proceed to the main topic, first let us know the different parts of the neurons and its functions. Neurons are also called nerve cells. These are highly specialized to transmit messages or nerve impulses from one part of the body to another. Neurons have a lot in common with other type of cells, but they're structurally and functionally unique. First is the cell body, which is a part of the neuron that processes and integrates information. It is also the metabolic center of the neuron. In addition, its transparent nucleus contains a prominent nucleolus. The second one is the dendrites, which is the part of the neuron that conveys incoming messages or electrical signals towards the cell body. For more information, neurons may have hundreds of branching dendrites, but depending on the neuron type. The third one is the axon, which is the part of the neuron that generates nerve impulses and typically conducts them away from the cell body. It carries the information along with long distances from one part of the neuron to another. And also take note that each neuron has only one axon. Second to the last is the axon hillock. As you can see in the picture, it is a cone-like region of the cell body. So the last one is the axon terminal, in which it transmits the information to the next cell in the chain. For more information again, a bundle of axons traveling together is called a nerve. Nerves can be very long, as they often need to transmit information over long distances.
So now let's move on to our main topic, which is the nerve impulse transmission. So first, let us know what is a nerve impulse. Nerve impulse is a signal that is transmitted along nerve fibers. And it is a brief reversal of membrane potential in which the membrane potential changes from negative 70 millivolt to positive 30 millivolt. It is actually a combination of two words, which is action and potential. The overall meaning of action potential is the potency of ions to generate actions. Did you know that action potential is extremely short-lived? It lasts for only about a millisecond, after which the original resting potential is restored once again, or it becomes repolarized.
Number 1 is the irritability, which is the ability to respond to a stimulus and convert it into a nerve impulse. Second is the conductivity, which is the ability to transmit the impulse to other neurons, muscles, or glands. Now let's talk about the electrical conditions of a resting neuron membranes. The plasma membrane of a resting or inactive neuron is polarized, which means that fewer positive ions are sitting on the inner face of the neuron's plasma membrane than there are on its outer face. The major positive ion inside the cell are potassium or K positive, while the significant positive ions are sodium or Na positive. Take note that as long as the inside remains more negative or fewer positive ions, that the outside of the neuron will stay inactive.
Many different types of stimuli excite neurons to become active and generate an impulse. For example, light excites the eye receptors, sound excites some ear receptors, and pressure excites some cutaneous receptors of the skin. Most neurons in the body are excited by neurotransmitter. When we say neurotransmitter, the body's chemical messengers. They are the molecules used by the nervous system to transmit messages between neurons or from neurons to muscles.
The resting membrane is polarized. When a neuron is not actively transmitting a nerve impulse, it is in a resting state, which is ready to transmit a nerve impulse, where the extracellular or outer part of the neuron ion is sodium, while the intracellular or inner part of the neuron ion is potassium. The membrane is relatively impermeable to both ions. Stimulus initiates local depolarization. A stimulus changes the permeability of a local patch of the membrane, and sodium ions diffuse rapidly into the cell. This changes the polarity of the membrane. The inside becomes more positive. The outside becomes more negative at that site. Depolarization and generation of an action potential. If the stimulus is strong enough, depolarization causes membrane polarity to be completely reversed, and an action potential is initiated. Depolarization, an event when there is inward rush of sodium ions, changes the polarity of the nearest membrane at that site.
Number 4 is the propagation of action potential. The polarization of the first membrane patch causes permeability changes in the adjacent membrane, and the events described in steps are repeated. Thus, the action potential propagates rapidly along the entire length of the membrane.
Fifth is repolarization. It is a phase where some potassium channels remain open and sodium channels reset. As a result of the positive charge created by depolarization, voltage-gated potassium channels open, and positively charged potassium ions rush out of the cell, reversing the polarity so that the inside of the cell is now negatively charged as compared to its surroundings. Repolarization, an event where there is an outflow of positive ions from the cell, restores the electrical conditions at the membrane to the polarized or resting state.
Initial ionic conditions restored. The ionic conditions of the resting state are restored later by the activity of the sodium-potassium pump. 3 sodium ions are ejected for every 2 potassium ions carried back into the cell. Sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump is a mechanism of active transport that moves sodium ions, Na+, out of cells and potassium ions, K+, into cells.
Transmission of the signal at synapses. A neurotransmitter chemical crosses the synapse to transmit the signal from one neuron to the next or to the target cell. These are the ways in how neurons communicate at chemical synapses. Number 1. Action potential arrives. Number 2. Vesicle fuses with plasma membrane. Number 3. Neurotransmitter is released into synaptic cleft. Number 4. Neurotransmitter binds to receptor on receiving neuron's membrane. Number 5. Ion channel opens. Number 6. Ion channel closes. Now that we know what happened within a neuron, we have to look at how these neurons actually communicate with each other. The process where electrical impulses are transmitted from one neuron to another is called synaptic neurotransmission. In order for the electrical impulse to be passed to another neuron, it must travel across to the synapse.
Synapse. It refers to the site where a cell neuron connects to another cell. It includes the end of the axons on one neuron and the dendrites of another cell, along with the gap between them.
We have even more specific terms to refer to the structures which make up a synapse. The end of the axon on the sending nerve's impulse, also called a presynaptic neuron or presynaptic terminal. This makes sense if we think about the word pre, which means it comes before. The ends of the dendrites on the cell receiving the nerve impulse is the postsynaptic cell or the postsynaptic terminal. Post, which means it comes after the synapse, and the gap between them is called synaptic cleft.
Now that we understand the structure of a synapse and all the key terms, let's take a look at how impulses are passed from the neurons to an adjacent cell. There are 6 main steps. Number 1 is storage. The neurotransmitter is stored in the presynaptic neurons is vesicles, which are more like sacs. Number 2 is release. When the presynaptic neurons is stimulated, the vesicles moves toward the presynaptic cleft and fuse with the presynaptic membrane, releasing neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft.
Number 3. Diffusion. Neurotransmitters diffuse across the synaptic cleft, carrying a signal to the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. Receptors are proteins that recognize and respond to chemical signals. Number 4. Binding. Neurotransmitters bind to specific receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Number 5, response. Binding of receptors and neurotransmitter triggers an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron.
For the last part of synaptic transmission, just take note that after the postsynaptic neuron has been stimulated. The last one is reuptake, in which neurotransmitter is released from receptor and broken down by enzymes before being taken up by the presynaptic neuron, so it can happen all over again.
Notice that the transmission of an impulse is an electrochemical event. Transmission down the length of the neuron's membrane is basically electrical, but the next neuron is stimulated by a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical. Because each neuron both receives signals from and sends signals to scores of other neurons, it carries on conversation with many different neurons at the same time.